Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this evening. I think we're going to give it just a few more minutes for some other folks to join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But thank you for being here. All right, welcome again to the people who are just calling in now. We're just giving it a few more minutes before we get started here. Good to see some familiar names showing up on the list there. Vinny, enjoyed your video on Sunday night for Ken. That was enjoyable. Great to see Ken get some recognition. Right. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a few more folks join in, but we'll let them just kind of jump on board when they get here. So welcome everyone to our webinar tonight. My name is Noah Borton. I'm the Senior Director of Educational Programs for the fraternity. So in that role, I work with all of our main education and leadership programs like our Leadership Institute, President's Academy, RLA, Dual, and then also I get the opportunity to work with all of our assessment initiatives. And so really chief among those being the membership outcomes and assessment project that we've been working on now. We've done 5 years of data collection and assessment and moving into our 6th year of such. So we have a good amount of data that we've been able to bring in, and a pretty exciting initiative as we've been able to learn quite a bit at both the kind of individual, chapter, and organizational level. So for tonight's webinar, we're really going to focus on really the chapter level. Certainly, if folks want to take it in some different directions, we can open up the conversation a little bit. But I think initially going to look to focus on really how we can take the data that we're receiving in those chapter reports and really try to utilize that to help inform decisions and work on the chapter and organizational level. I think that we primarily have advisors and alumni who have joined us this evening. So I think the majority of the focus and intent of the discussion will be kind of focused toward that, sort of advisor to sort of active chapter discussion. But I do think this certainly can be applicable as well for a peer-to-peer conversation and thinking about like a chapter leader having some of these same conversations and using the data in the same way as they work with other members of the executive board or perhaps a committee or the active chapter that they're working with. So that is our setup for the night. As we're going along, feel free to chime in the chat box or ask questions, and we can get to those. I think we can be pretty informal. I know that I think some folks have probably sat in on a number of presentations that I've done around the membership outcomes assessments, so I'll try not to be too repetitive on some things that you may have heard before, but I also know that we may have some people that are a little bit newer to hearing about some of these things. So if we skip over some stuff and you want a little more background, then certainly chime in, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go, and certainly happy to provide some greater depth on just areas of this that you find interesting. All right, so I want to start off by just explaining maybe a couple of just some fun statistics that I pulled out, some demographics that we pulled out of the survey, and just show you a couple of little tidbits here, in part just because I thought some of these were fun. Like we saw that 10.7% of our respondents this year were legacies, 12.8% were first generation college students, and 47% had jobs the previous year. And that was actually a little downtick from the previous year. Probably the most important data point on here, though, really is going to be the fact that we had an 80% response rate in our data collection, you can see. And, really why that's important is because that speaks to pretty substantial credibility of the data. I think we can feel confident that the data is a good representation of what our members are thinking, feeling, experiencing in their membership experience. Right. Now, I mentioned this is the 5th year that we've done data collection. Every single year we've been in kind of the 78 to 80, 81% range. So we've really been in about a 2% window there. So we've had good, strong response rates every single year, which has been great in terms of providing some consistency in the data. Also been great in terms of allowing us to track progress over time. And also certainly part of where that has value is when we get strong response rates on the chapter level, then that gives us some good high quality data that we can communicate back to chapters and show you all as advisors and show undergraduate chapters a snapshot of what's going on within the chapter. Certainly important to point out that the data collection took place last primarily January. So we launched end of January, then data collection took place through February and into March. And so the reason why, I reference that is, I do think as we're looking at the data, we have to contextualize it a little bit. And as we're looking at what some of this might mean, we have to understand that students were responding to these questions in that specific moment in time. And so, we have to ask ourselves, were there some things happening in that moment that may have influenced our answers, and also certainly something that's quite relevant now is obviously the world has changed in dramatic fashion since March, yet the majority of the responses that we received, the the sizable majority did not come in, before things really were impacted by the pandemic. And so, in terms of thinking about, how has the pandemic impacted the fraternity experience, we won't really be able to ask those questions and collect that data until our next round of data collection in 2021. But then, when we think about it, we will have a pretty interesting pre and post there, as we will have collected data on the chapter and individual level, immediately before the world sort of turned upside down, and then we will have this this checkpoint there in 2021. So we'll have that conversation at a webinar down the road here. The ultimate point here, we have, I think, some good quality data to think about member attitudes, beliefs, experiences, behaviors. Now, how do we utilize this information? I included a quote here from the president of one of our chapters, Western Reserve chapter. I know Clayton has been someone who's done a lot of work with his chapter around being able to use the membership outcomes report and the data from the report to have conversations with the executive board to inform some of their conversations. They've actually done some of their own work in developing kind of their own membership survey around their personal needs and what it is that they're looking for out of their membership experience. And so they've really used those two things in concert together to really try to create a data-driven chapter experience. And I think they've had some really great results out of that. So just included this as one example of how one undergraduate leader has felt like he's been able to receive some value out of having some of these data-driven conversations in the chapter. And I do find that students are willing to have conversations with this. And I think, even I've definitely been at a number of leadership programs where we'll mention the membership outcomes assessment, and we'll actually have a line, kind of down the hallway of students wanting to dig in more, wanting to ask questions, wanting to know what this means for their chapter. Last year, I was visiting another chapter. Actually, I see Dan Ladendorf is on here. So I was down in Bloomington meeting with Dan's guys down at Indiana, and it was kind of interesting. They're certainly known for their heavy presence in the business school, and so we had a good kind of 90-minute discussion around putting some of the data up on the whiteboard and kicking some ideas around about what this means and how this can inform our decisions. And got to the end, the guys were like, this is great. They were like, this is what we do all day in class. We get statistics on a business, we get data and research on a business, and we try to identify the best case or best strategy to move forward with the business. And so it was kind of interesting to see them make that connection to their academic endeavors. So I've mentioned on a couple of occasions here the membership outcomes chapter report. And so here is an example of what that looks like, just a sample. So you can see our Williams chapter doing very strong. All of their areas are looking very good. Now, I'm guessing a number of you have probably seen this. If you have not, then you can certainly contact me or contact your chapter liaison, and we can provide that for you. We send this out every summer, and then we also provide it at educational programs, and certainly it's available upon request. Now, this provides only a snapshot of the data. We collect, and depending on the year, 35 or so different variables for each chapter. Now, we don't include the data for all of those variables in our chapter reports, because I think that we find that would get a little bit cumbersome, especially when you start looking at, comparing year over year data. It can be a lot of numbers coming at you. So we try to provide this as a little bit of a more digestible way of consuming some of the information. So you can see we provide the data for the Brotherhood scale. So this is one of the core measures of the membership outcomes assessment. And I think we presented on this in several other webinars. So I won't go as in depth on that in this one, but certainly if you would like to dig into that a little more, we can. But we show the measures for the solidarity, shared social belonging, and accountability. And I think when you look at those 4 measures in concert together, you can really get a pretty good picture of the chapter environment, and it really kind of helps speak to chapter culture. And then the other variables really kind of help to enrich our understanding of what that chapter environment means and what contributing factors might be creating that environment. And so that's where we include several variables that we see as maybe strengths, areas where the chapter is performing maybe above average for the fraternity, some areas for improvement, and then also include some areas for greatest change, as sometimes that can be informative and seeing maybe you might have an area where that's been a programming priority in the last year, and it can be affirming to see like, yes, that programming that we did have a significant impact, and we see that the chapter's improved in this area. Or you can see maybe we had a real decline in our commitment measures in the last year, and so that really says there's something there where members are just not feeling as committed and connected to the chapter. So that's something we need to figure out why that is the case and dig into that before we start losing members, right? So then on the next page, you see we provide a little bit of analysis. Clearly, this is just a little snapshot. We're talking half page just to provide a little bit of context and some more explanation as to what some of these numbers might mean. Now, certainly, again, all of this needs to be taken somewhat in context as to when the data was collected, and also I think this is not communicated with the intent of saying like, this is the definitive statement on the chapter. This is meant to really provide some additional information for folks like yourself and for the chapter to think about, and then maybe use that to help inform your discussions as you really decide how to take what you can learn from this data report and turn it into actionable items to improve the chapter. And then that also speaks directly to the final area there, which would be opportunities for improvement, which is just some recommendations based on some of the areas for improvement, maybe areas of greatest change in the previous year. Now, clearly, again, this is not an all-encompassing list of every action item maybe that the chapter should implement in the upcoming year, but provides maybe a digestible place to start of here are a few things to think about, and then that can be a start of a conversation for the chapter's action planning in the upcoming year. So that's the chapter report that we provide to you, and ideally this would really be something that you would be able to take and chapter leaders would be able to take and present, and kind of sit down with it and actually open up some discussions around what this means and what we're going to do with the information. Because if it just becomes a report, then it doesn't really have a lot of value. So I always open up kind of all of these conversations by saying that the purpose of this is to create discussion on the chapter level. We want you talking about this. We want you thinking about what does this mean for us, and why might this be the case for us. So some examples of places where I think, especially on the advisor level, you could be doing this. Certainly executive boards and chapter meetings. I think doing a session maybe at a chapter retreat or in an executive board meeting, I kind of referenced before as a part of a transition conversation with the Indiana Executive Board that we actually got the whiteboard out and we were putting up some of the key numbers and like talking about maybe how different variables might relate to one another and drawing connections and showing where things were above average and below average. And and ultimately the point was not the numbers. The point, the real richness that came out of that was the conversation that the guys were having about the things that they needed to be doing in their brotherhood programming and in their social programming and in some of their membership development programming in the upcoming year, right? So we were able to kind of pivot that to connection to actionable items for the chapter, right? I think another thing could certainly be to do like an actual presentation at meeting. Maybe that could be like a follow-up to an executive board meeting and a way to show some support for some of these plans. Like, hey, here are the priorities for the chapter. Here are action items that we're putting in place this year. And, here is some data that we received from our data report that we're using to help inform some of these decisions, so that you can see there's something behind this. This is not just something we came up with out of thin air, right? So I think that can be something that can certainly have value. And then if you're talking about, practical application within the chapter, that can set up nicely for, some things like accreditation programs, Greek awards programs, things like that. We identified this need, we have data to support, this is a priority in the chapter, here are the steps we implemented to try to address that need, and now here's the progress we think we've made in the previous year. That sets up as a pretty nice continuum for the chapter and a pretty good presentation for the chapter to be able to deliver to other stakeholders. Some questions to consider that I would throw out there, things like for the areas of strengths, are there operations or programs we implemented in the last year? So, most definitely have seen a number of instances where I've been having a conversation with a chapter and said like, oh, it looks like you've really improved in this area. Or, I saw groups that maybe really improved around some of the sexual assault prevention measures. And they talked about, we really prioritize that in our programming. We really put emphasis on that the last year. Saw areas where, maybe the commitment measures really improved, and you hear them talking about how they really overhauled their recruitment and membership education programs. And so, it can be a good way to provide some affirmation to those practices, and also provide just kind of a pat on the back of like, look, you did a good job here, and we have some data to support evidence-based practice, and so let's double down on that and continue to improve in those areas. Another thing to chew on, I think, is for the areas for improvement, what might be happening to cause this? Because I think an important piece is the data can give you a number, right? It can tell you something that is happening, right? It can tell you that an attitude exists, or that a behavior has taken place, or that maybe members are feeling a certain way, but it can't necessarily always provide you all of the information around why that is the case or what is contributing to that. And so that's where, you need to really dig into that a little bit more, and actually I was having another conversation with a chapter president last year, and I said, wow, your belonging like really took a dip. He was like, oh yeah, when did we take that again? I was like, well, you guys fill it out in like February. He's like, oh yeah, we just all hated each other that month. It's like we were really kind of going at it with each other that month, and so we've had to work on that. So, you can see sometimes by trying to ask what is happening within the chapter that can be a contributing factor, it can pull out maybe some things that are priorities for the chapter to address on an operational level. And that gets again into, did something happen around the time that we took the survey? Was there some sort of incident or some sort of conflict in the chapter, or some sort of challenge that came up that might have influenced the way the guys were responding here? Certainly as we look into the data that we collect next year, obviously understanding the experience guys have had this fall is going to have a significant impact on how they're responding, and so we have to analyze the data with that in mind, right, and have conversations with guys about that. And then also just I think providing some forum to say, you know, why do you think your members feel this way? Why do you think this attitude exists in the chapter? What might be happening that can cause this? Just some general questions that can open up discussion, and then that can sometimes provide some themes that you can follow up on and dig more out of. I think, you know, very similar in sort of the one-on-ones, you know, if you're sitting down maybe with a chapter president or a vice president, you know, as a part of a transition meeting or maybe a goal setting meeting, you know, I think you frame this discussion as an opportunity to improve. I think sometimes you can find that students will get maybe even a little defensive, or they'll want to be like, you know, they want everything to be perfect, like we're great, we're doing well, and to acknowledge like it's okay that, you know, maybe a variable isn't stellar, or maybe we're below average on something, or maybe there's an area where we can improve operations, because the whole point of this is to provide a cycle for continuous improvement and get the data that we need to understand, you know, how we need to improve. So I think that can be a good starting place for the conversation and kind of how you frame it up. And then, you know, maybe try to bring some of it back to their own personal experience, you know, and thinking about, you know, how does the data points how the data points might highlight issues or challenges they've personally experienced, you know, or even certainly a common one there will be around maybe like belonging and connection, tying back into challenges with attendance and getting people to show up and getting, you know, member engagement, and recognizing that, you know, if you're having a hard time getting guys to show up to meeting or getting guys to participate in things, and we can show the data, you know, is indicating that our belonging is really low, our commitment is really low, guys aren't feeling connected to each other, we don't have strong relationships in the chapter, then we need to get at that core kind of fundamental issue there, so that guys feel connected, guys feel cared about, guys feel like they want to be a part of something, rather than trying to address just the attendance, right? Because no attendance program or point system or fines system is going to end up making up for the fact that guys aren't feeling a strong connection within the chapter. So we've got to figure out what is really the fundamental underlying issue to that challenge, right? So that can open up a discussion there. You know, maybe putting it to their personal experience, think about, does this support how you have personally felt in the chapter this year? And maybe do you think the chapter needs to improve in these areas? So, you know, just kind of, you know, start to get some of their input and get some of their thoughts. And it's okay if they have some differing opinions, and certainly you can use that as a way to give them an opportunity to reflect and share some of their own personal perspectives on the chapter, right? So that would just be some thoughts I would give on how to facilitate some of those conversations. Now, I do think that an issue that I run into sometimes with this is, you know, students will get defensive sometimes, or say, you know, I don't think that this is right, or, you know, my members don't think this, or they'll want to really challenge the credibility of the data. You know, certainly acknowledge that it's possible that someone could decide to, you know, fill out the survey incorrectly. It's certainly possible that, you know, someone could just lie on everything. But, you know, I don't think that we see that substantially across the board. And also when you have, you know, such a high response rate, then that also does mitigate the impact of some, you know, kind of false answers. And we do have measures in place to make sure that we kind of catch some of the guys that are just sort of, you know, screwing off and like putting like 1 for every answer or 5 for every answer, or making a pattern or something. So we do catch some of those kind of bogus responses. So, you know, rather than kind of getting bogged down in sort of the conversation about, well, this is incredible, this isn't real, because I know my guys don't think that, I just kind of frame it as like, well, this is how your members responded, right? So I'm not here to say like it's good or bad necessarily. I'm not here to say that, you know, this is something that should or should not happen, but the reality is this is what people in your chapter said, right? So what I can do is just provide you with a reflection of, an accurate reflection of what their responses were and how they feel about their experience. And so then what you can do is just try to ask, well, why would they respond in that way, or why do members feel that way? And I think sometimes that can kind of let the guard down a little bit and let some of the defensiveness down a little bit, so that guys recognize that, we're not trying to, out people or come after people or judge people, that, really we're just trying to find the information that can help us make good decisions and set up an optimal chapter experience, right? I think that another thing we will see in this sometimes is, sometimes around, especially around like the attitudes and whatnot, you'll get some surprises, because there are some kind of attitudes and behaviors that, are related to some of the loss prevention measures around looking at things related to the hazing environment or hazing attitudes, hazing rationale, as well as looking at attitudes around sexual assault prevention, and certainly some other attitudes around like kind of moral and ethical decision making. And so, sometimes you'll have guys that will see maybe some concerning attitudes and say like, well, I don't really see this, or maybe, this is the environment is saying that we're doing this, but we're really not engaging in these behaviors. And I think, that's where we see sometimes maybe you might have some situations where maybe some attitudes exist within the chapter, within a group, or maybe something is starting to impact the environment within a chapter, but maybe it hasn't translated into behavior for some reason. Maybe that is, think about you have strong leadership in place that is preventing those attitudes from, translating into behavior. Maybe you have some other structural things in place that have prevented some of those things. But, ultimately, I think where we can see some value in that is this tells us, hey, look, we have some guys in the chapter that maybe have some attitudes that are concerning for what we would want out of the chapter experience, right? So rather than sitting back and waiting until that translates into some problematic behaviors, we can address it now, and we can engage in some intervention and some education now before this is something that becomes problematic. So I think really trying to make that something where we can have some more proactive behavior or intervention maybe, and hopefully head off some issues before we end up in sort of that reactive mode after some problems have emerged in a chapter. So I think that can also be a way I've found to kind of diffuse some of the concern. And then also I think a lot of times when I phrase it that way, I've also found the students kind of start to think and be like, yeah, I can actually think of some places in the chapter where, some guys have maybe said some things or vocalized some attitudes, and we've kind of, addressed it, but, I can see how we need to continue to address that so that that doesn't catch on in the chapter. So then last couple of things I'll go over here. I just wanted to touch briefly on two of the areas of the Brotherhood scale that we tend to emphasize in this work. So I think especially as we're talking about, what do you do? How do we improve? I think two of the sort of best things to focus on that we found, and the kind of the things that if we pull these levers, then we're going to get everything moving in the right direction, are this idea of brotherhood belonging and brotherhood accountability. And so the belonging measure is this idea of, brotherhood best describes me, or brotherhood best described as my brothers value and appreciate me, right? So this is kind of this idea of the home away from home. My brothers know who I am and love me and appreciate me because of that, right? And you can see that, well, this is just a little bit of data just as I left in here from another presentation, just so you could, see a little bit of context where we are. So we've been pretty consistent on that in the last couple of years. We are a little below the national average on that. So it is a priority of wanting to try to improve belonging on the chapter level throughout the organization. I think ideally we'd like to see chapters above a 4.3. But we have seen more chapters above that kind of 4.3 measure than in previous years, and so that is a positive sign and one that we want to keep developing. Did some focus groups last year, and this is just a thought that I pulled out of one of those to kind of highlight what this belonging really looks like. And everyone has their own issues going on with them, personal or back home. You have people here who are here for you. I'm always happy when I'm here. So again, really kind of getting at that home away from home idea, that place that like everyone here is valued for who they are. They don't have to pretend to be something they're not, right? And so when we start thinking about how to kind of operationalize this and how to put in practices that can really drive healthier belonging. Certainly, we look at starting at the very beginning and looking at recruitment practices, really focusing on recruitment practices that are, developing meaningful connections, creating conversation, really working with guys on their ability to, be genuine, to be able to have interpersonal conversations with guys, to kind of get below some of the surface level stuff and really start to dig into, who people are, what's important to them, what they're looking for out of their college experience. So I think certainly one piece is looking at, and I think a good thing for an advisor to do in looking at belonging is, providing some additional support around kind of that recruitment planning process and talking to the chapter about how they can create a process that, more emphasizes that idea of developing genuine connection and relationships, then certainly translating that directly into or connecting that directly into the associate member experience, and certainly utilizing the associate member program effectively, creating healthy engagement between members of the chapter and the associate member class, creating opportunities to have conversations, to create some self-revelation, to do some team building experiences, to do some projects together where they're actually like planning events and having some successes and having some things to celebrate together. And those would be some aspects to look at focusing on. So let's see here. I see. Oh, sorry, Kevin. Just saw your question. Glad that I'm back. But anyway, so that's some pieces on belonging. Some other stuff we're really emphasizing the Brotherhood development programs around belonging, and I think this year actually is probably a pretty pertinent year for emphasizing that. I was having a conversation with one of the Missouri advisors earlier in the year, and he had the tag of, this is the year of brotherhood, and I think I could not have phrased it any better myself. That you're looking at from a social aspect, those kind of small brotherhood engagement opportunities are really going to be among the only things that we're going to see chapters being able to do for the foreseeable future. And so I think really pitching that as an opportunity to emphasize this belonging by having, small group or, one-on-one interactions where we're creating activity, giving guys things to do, and creating just that time together where we're getting to know each other through shared interest and through meaningful revelation can be, and sometimes that's through a social endeavor, sometimes maybe that's through more of an educationally oriented conversation, sometimes that's through more of like a leadership retreat type conversation, but I think all of those things can really help to create a robust brotherhood program that can really facilitate belonging. And so definitely want to reference, we do have some resources on both the associate member education page on the website, as well as under the chapter resources page, where we have some resources on just ideas for brotherhood programs, and ideas for creating engagement within the chapter. And I think as simple as that sounds, I think that is an area where we have found that some chapters are just lacking. They're just not doing some of those organized opportunities for guys to get together and do things together. And so facilitating some of that can have some good positive outcomes for the chapter. Similarly, seeing accountability as being a key focus area. This is the idea of brotherhood, best described as my brothers make me a better man by holding me to high standards. And so another priority for the chapter, we did see this go down a little bit this year. Again, this is an area where we'd like to see kind of groups above kind of that 4-3 range. And so something we're really looking to focus on in the upcoming year. Another kind of example, kind of describing what accountability brotherhood looks like on the chapter level. A focus group participant said, I would say wanting and facilitating in the success of others, not the traditional definition of success of you got this job or whatever, but you help their moral and social development, help the various aspects of their lives that help them have a successful life. And so I thought that was really just kind of a perfect articulation of what we're trying to get at here, that this is, and I think really you can kind of see that concept of building better men within this really resonating for the guys. But, clearly there is this kind of formal aspect of accountability, and there is the idea of, adherence to policy, having standards boards in place, you make a poor decision, you have some accountability measures. But there's also kind of the informal aspect where, you're really trying to promote more of like the culture of accountability around the chapter, where, somebody does something they shouldn't do, then, like anyone can just kind of, engage in some corrective action, hey, don't do that, don't say that, come on, you're better than that. And issue some of that challenge and intervention in an informal way, right? And kind of, the joke I always make when I'm having this conversation with students is, when I'm like issuing my kind of own standards and expectations of like, I really care about fitness and I want to go to the gym and I like to work out, and if I've been lazy for a couple of days and haven't gone to the gym for a couple of days, haven't followed through on my commitments for a couple of days, I don't need to be taken to standards board, right? I don't need a judicial referral. I just need, a buddy to say like, hey, come on, snap out of it, let's go. So, having some conversation around what that informal accountability can look like within the chapter can have a lot of value in this, I think. And then another aspect of this that I don't know that we always talk about, and I think something we really want to try to develop more in the upcoming year or two, is kind of this idea of accountability around this kind of brotherhood established around my brothers develop me and help me become a better person, right? So kind of this idea of like my brothers see more in me maybe than I even see in myself. My brothers challenge me to live up to these high expectations, or maybe, push me to achieve something that I didn't know I was capable of achieving, right? And so really kind of this, positive encouragement and support as a part of this accountability idea, right? And so, some things to think about within that are certainly having some conversations around, standards for membership, even having like a semesterly or annual conversation around, what are kind of the expectations that we want to set for each other as brothers this year, and have an actual conversation about how we're going to, formally and informally hold each other accountable to those standards and expectations. I think you may see some things we're actually maybe needing to have some programming and some educational development around some of the skills on this, thinking about programming for, interpersonal skills, having some interpersonal confrontations, or maybe, developing some communication skills that will, help in facilitating some of these conversations can maybe be a programming point to dig into. I think certainly talking about I think another area that I've tried to get chapters to work on is maybe providing forums for members to maybe share successes or share kind of out of chapter endeavors. So think about, can you have something where chapter members can share, that research project that they're on, or talk about, that internship or co-op that they've had this year, or share their senior thesis with the chapter, or talk about their on-campus job, or the athletic team that they're a part of and what their season was like. Just a way to, I think, kind of build up the various aspects of the lives that our members have, provide some sharing on that, which can really help develop belonging, but then also, I think, really kind of challenge each other to achieve as well, which can kind of get to this idea of member accountability. So thinking about ways to, celebrate successes, to kind of share some of these other endeavors members are engaging in, to encourage members to be involved in some of, these maybe educationally purposeful activities, outside of the chapter and outside of the classroom, like, undergraduate research and, career development opportunities and study abroad and internships, things that in large part, I think a lot of our members are already doing, but maybe trying to find some opportunities for them to be able to bring that experience back to the chapter a little more. I think can be also a great way to help, develop some of that self-confidence and sharing that can really help support some of this accountability measure as well. And then I think final piece I'll mention on this, we've seen some chapters really have a lot of success around academic support groups and brotherhood accountability. And so that would be another kind of intervention measure to think about, having groups put together around common academic interest, or, common major, or maybe, something like a big brother relationship or something, but something where guys can provide some mutual peer support, provide, get together and study, not necessarily in like the formal kind of proctored study hours way, but much more in kind of the social support way, that I've got someone who, I think actually a comment that I heard from one of the guys in another focus group I was doing was, he was like, well, I'm sitting around with the guys and like these other three guys are studying. I'm not going to be the like one guy that's not studying tonight, so you can see kind of this idea of like challenging each other through that to work harder to achieve more, but then also having some kind of support on the back end of knowing like, well, I'm really struggling in this area, and I know I can get some tutoring or assistance from some other members, or I can get some guidance on classes to take and directions to take in this major as well. So, formalizing some of that a little bit and creating some of those academic support groups on a smaller level, we're also finding as being a really integral way of building up some of this accountability brotherhood. So a couple of just quick ideas, and I was running through those pretty quick, but wanted to just try to give some kind of tangible and pragmatic ways to take some of what you might see on the paper and like turn that into some ideas and conversations with your students. And so hopefully that can be helpful in giving you some tools for facilitating some discussion and dialogue on the chapter level. So with that, would ask if there are any questions or thoughts before we wrap it up here tonight. Appreciate everybody joining us. always happy for the opportunity to talk a little assessment and share some data and talk about how to share more of our data with our chapters. I guess just as one other follow-up piece, certainly I mentioned that we do have kind of more extensive data reports on each chapter available. But if you would like to discuss further or dig into maybe some of the trends, what we've seen with the chapter over the last few years or anything, more than happy to share that. The only reason we don't send that out initially is just not wanting to overwhelm everybody with gigantic spreadsheets full of numbers. But happy to set time up to process through some of that with folks if that would be helpful with anyone. And if there's any additional conversation you'd like to have, or if you'd like to have me or another staff member join in and talking through any of this with the chapter or an executive board, also happy to do that as well. So with that, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. So we'll say thank you once again for joining us and wish you all a good evening.